What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a routine morning interview, only to have the entire conversation spiral into one of the most intense on-air moments in recent television history? That's exactly what unfolded when Denzel Washington appeared on Good Morning America. And what started as casual banter with Michael Strahan quickly transformed into something nobody in that studio was prepared for. Before we get into what actually went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me who you think was in the right here. Because trust me, you're going to have opinions after hearing this. The segment began innocently enough. Michael Strahan welcomed Denzel to the set with his signature smile. Denzel settled into the chair, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. They talked about his latest project, his preparation process, the dedication required to transform into his character. Denzel was eloquent as always, giving the audience exactly the kind of insight they tune in for. But then, Michael shifted gears. He brought up a topic that had been circulating for weeks. A comment Denzel had made about the current state of cinema and what he called the industry's lack of substance. Michael's tone was still friendly, but there was an edge to the question. He asked Denzel to clarify those comments, specifically whether he was calling out his fellow actors or speaking more broadly about the system itself. Denzel paused. Anyone paying attention could see the shift in his demeanor. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there moments earlier. He explained that his comments were never meant as personal attacks, that he has tremendous respect for everyone working in the industry. But yes, he stood by what he said. Cinema has become increasingly formulaic. Studios prioritize box office returns over artistic merit. Streaming platforms have changed everything in ways both good and problematic. Michael nodded along, but then he pressed further. He mentioned specific actors by name, younger stars who've achieved massive success through franchise films, and asked if Denzel thought their work lacked the substance he was advocating for. The temperature in the studio changed. Denzel's expression hardened. He leaned forward, maintaining direct eye contact in a way that made it clear this wasn't casual conversation anymore. Denzel said he wasn't going to play that game. He wasn't there to tear down other actors, especially young people trying to make their way in this profession. But then he turned the question around on Michael. He asked why the focus was always on creating division, on pitting people against each other, on manufacturing conflict for headlines rather than having substantive discussions about the actual issues facing the industry. His voice remained calm, controlled, but there was unmistakable intensity behind every word. Michael seemed caught off guard. He clarified that he wasn't trying to create conflict, just asking Denzel to expand on his own statements. But Denzel wasn't backing down. He said that's exactly the problem. That framing the conversation around specific individuals rather than systemic issues keeps the industry from evolving, from addressing real challenges that impact everyone from actors to crew members to audiences who deserve better content. Michael attempted to steer back to safer territory, bringing up Denzel's philanthropic work. But Denzel interrupted him. He said he appreciated the attempt to move on, but he wanted to address something directly. He asked why morning shows, news programs, entertainment media in general seemed so invested in superficial coverage, in sound bites and viral moments, rather than meaningful dialogue. Michael's smile faltered. He reminded Denzel that this was a morning show, that their audience tunes in for variety, that balancing entertainment with substance is part of the format. Denzel nodded slowly, then asked if Michael truly believed that was good enough. If he thought giving audiences what they supposedly want, rather than challenging them to think more critically, was really the best approach. The question put Michael in an uncomfortable position on his own show. There was a moment of silence that felt much longer than it was. Producers off camera were likely scrambling. Michael gathered himself and responded that accessibility matters too, that reaching millions of people every morning means connecting with diverse audiences who have different needs. Denzel challenged that immediately. He said accessibility shouldn't mean dumbing down content, that you can be entertaining and substantive simultaneously, that underestimating audiences has become an excuse for laziness across the entire media landscape. He brought up how complex issues get reduced to partisan talking points, how entertainment journalism focuses on celebrity gossip rather than artistic analysis, how even interviews like this one default to safe questions. Michael tried to engage, pointing out that the media landscape is shaped by audience metrics, by what people click on and share. He suggested maybe the responsibility isn't solely on journalists and producers, but also on audiences to demand better content. Denzel seized on that. He said that ignores the power dynamic at play. Media companies, studios, networks have enormous resources and influence. They shape narratives, determine what gets coverage, decide what stories matter. Putting the responsibility back on audiences feels like passing the buck. People with platforms have a greater obligation to use those tools responsibly. Michael acknowledged Denzel's concerns, but then pointed out that Denzel himself has been part of major studio productions, big-budget films with commercial considerations. He asked how Denzel reconciles his criticism with his participation in the very system he's critiquing. Denzel didn't hesitate. That's exactly why he can speak on it, because he's been in those rooms, made those compromises, seen how decisions get made. He talked about the constant negotiation between artistic vision and commercial viability. But acknowledging reality doesn't mean accepting it as inevitable. Critique from within can be more powerful than criticism from the outside. Michael asked if Denzel's approach is realistic for most people in the industry, for actors who don't have his level of success, who need to take whatever work they can get. It was a strong counterpoint, highlighting the privilege in Denzel's position. Denzel's expression softened slightly. He said that's the tragedy of it all, that the system is designed to keep people dependent, to make artistic integrity feel like a luxury only the successful can afford. The industry exploits young actors, pays crew members inadequate wages, creates an environment where speaking up can end your career before it begins. That's why systemic change matters. Why it can't just be about individual choices but transforming the structures that limit those choices. Then Denzel did something that shifted everything. He asked Michael directly if he felt like he could speak freely on this show, if he could challenge the network's decisions, criticize the corporate structure, question the priorities that shape the content millions consume every morning. The question hung there, impossibly heavy, and Michael's face showed the complexity of trying to answer honestly, while knowing his bosses were likely watching this entire exchange unfold. Michael took a breath, clearly weighing his words carefully. He started to say something about professional boundaries, about how every job has constraints, but Denzel cut him off. He said that's not what he asked. He asked if Michael could speak freely, not whether he understood workplace limitations. The distinction mattered, and everyone watching could feel it. Michael's jaw tightened. He said honestly, no, he probably couldn't say everything he thinks about how the network operates, about decisions made above his pay grade, but he added that most people can't speak completely freely in their jobs. That's just reality. Denzel nodded slowly, then asked if that reality should be acceptable, especially for people whose job is supposedly to inform the public, to ask hard questions, to hold power accountable. Michael pointed out that he asks plenty of hard questions, that GMA covers serious topics, that they balance different kinds of content. Denzel agreed they cover serious topics, but questioned how deeply, how critically, how willing they are to actually challenge powerful interests rather than just reporting on surface-level conflicts. Michael's professionalism was wearing thin. He asked Denzel what he wanted, whether he expected morning shows to become investigative journalism programs. Denzel said he expected honesty, consistency, a recognition that entertainment and substance aren't mutually exclusive, that treating audiences like they can't handle complexity is insulting. Then Denzel brought up something specific. He mentioned a recent news story the show had covered, a celebrity scandal that got extensive airtime while a significant policy decision barely got mentioned. He asked Michael how those editorial choices get made, who decides what matters. Michael looked genuinely uncomfortable. He said he doesn't make those decisions alone, that there's a whole team, that they consider multiple factors. Denzel pressed him, asking if he ever pushes back, if he ever argues for different priorities, if he uses whatever influence he has to advocate for coverage that might be less flashy but more important. Michael said yes, sometimes, but he also has to pick his battles, has to maintain working relationships. Denzel asked if that means accepting things he knows are wrong. If career preservation takes precedence over doing what's right, the question landed hard. Michael defended himself, saying it's easy for Denzel to take absolute positions when he's Denzel Washington, when he has the freedom to turn down work, to speak his mind without worrying about getting fired. Most people don't have that luxury. And Denzel's criticism, while maybe valid in theory, doesn't account for real pressures people face. Denzel acknowledged that, but then pointed out that Michael isn't just anybody either. He's Michael Strahan, someone with leverage and options. If he can't push for change from his position, who can? And if nobody with power and security is willing to take risks, how does anything ever improve? Michael sat back, processing that. He said Denzel was right about some things, that the system has problems, that compromises get made that maybe shouldn't be, but change is complicated. Working within structures while trying to improve them is different from blowing everything up. Denzel asked how much incremental progress they've actually seen, whether the changes have been meaningful or mostly cosmetic. Michael didn't have a quick answer, and the silence stretched out. Then Michael shifted tactics. He brought up Denzel's own career, specific films he's done that were big studio productions. He asked if every single choice Denzel has made aligned perfectly with his principles, if he's never taken a role primarily for the paycheck. Denzel said, of course he has. He's never claimed to be perfect, but the difference is that he's willing to examine those choices, to acknowledge the compromises, to be honest about the tension between ideals and practicality. He asked if Michael could say the same, if he's really grappled with what it means to be part of a media machine that shapes public consciousness while being shaped by corporate interests. Michael said he thinks about it more than Denzel might imagine, that it keeps him up some nights. But working in media means accepting certain realities. Means finding ways to do good work within imperfect systems. Denzel leaned forward. He said, accepting reality and resigning yourself to it are different things. He talked about the responsibility that comes with reaching millions of people every morning, with being a voice people trust, with having the opportunity to influence what people think about, what they care about. Michael asked what Denzel thought he should do differently, specifically, concretely. Denzel said he should ask harder questions, push back on editorial decisions that prioritize clickbait over substance, use his platform to elevate important issues even when they're not trending, be willing to make people uncomfortable, including his bosses. Michael laughed, but it wasn't happy. He said that's a great way to get replaced, that networks don't keep hosts who make life difficult. Denzel said that fear is exactly what keeps the system functioning, that everyone's afraid of being replaced, so everyone plays along. And meanwhile, nothing changes. Michael looked directly at Denzel and said this was easy for him to say, that Denzel could walk away from Hollywood tomorrow and be fine. But most people need their jobs, need their income, need to think about their families. Denzel said he understood, but that's why those who do have security have an even greater responsibility to speak up, to take risks, to use their positions to create space for others. He said if people like him and Michael won't challenge the system, who will? The assistants who can be fired without anyone noticing. The young actors desperate for their first break. Michael was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, less defensive. He said Denzel had a point, that maybe he'd gotten comfortable, that maybe the perks and salary had made him less willing to rock the boat, but he genuinely believes in the work they do, that GMA provides value to people. Denzel said he's not saying it's meaningless. He's saying it could be better, that good isn't good enough when you have the resources to be great. He talked about the potential of morning television, how it could genuinely educate people, provide context and analysis, challenge viewers to think critically. Michael asked if Denzel had ever considered how exhausting it is to be constantly challenged, to engage with difficult topics before you've even had your coffee. Sometimes people need lightness, need entertainment, need a break from the relentless barrage of crises. Denzel said he gets that. But there's a difference between providing occasional relief and building an entire media ecosystem around avoidance. People are suffering, systems are failing, and media institutions have a choice about whether to help people understand these realities or help them tune out. Michael said both things can coexist. That balance is important. Denzel agreed, balance matters, but asked what the actual balance is. Whether they spend equal time on substance and fluff, whether serious coverage gets the same production value as viral moments. Michael brought up ratings. The fact that lighter content consistently performs better, that audiences click away when things get too heavy. Denzel said maybe that's because they've been trained to expect easy consumption, because media has spent decades conditioning people rather than challenging them to engage more deeply. Michael asked how you break that cycle when you're dependent on those audiences for survival. When advertisers pay based on viewership, Denzel said you start by trying, by experimenting, by trusting that audiences might rise to the occasion if given the chance. They continued exploring these tensions. Michael now fully engaged, not just defending, but genuinely grappling with the questions. He admitted uncertainty about some things, acknowledged tensions he hadn't fully resolved. Denzel appreciated that honesty, said uncertainty might be more valuable than certainty, that questioning yourself and your industry is the first step toward meaningful change. The problem isn't that people in media don't care, it's that they care about too many competing things. Michael said, that's exactly right. That every day involves navigating competing demands. Denzel said maybe the answer isn't balance but priority, that at some point you have to decide what matters most. Michael asked, what should matter most? Denzel said truth, even when uncomfortable, even when complicated. Responsibility to the public, to democracy should outweigh responsibility to shareholders and ratings. Michael said, that's idealistic. And Denzel said, idealism is only impractical if you decide it is. The interview had long exceeded its scheduled time. Producers were definitely having conversations about whether to cut to commercial. Michael glanced off camera briefly, likely getting some signal, but he didn't wrap things up. Instead, he asked Denzel one more question. He asked if Denzel thought this conversation, this interview, was accomplishing anything, if challenging each other on live television was actually productive or just performative, just another spectacle for people to consume and forget. Denzel considered that carefully before responding. Denzel said he didn't know if it was accomplishing anything, that he couldn't control how people would receive this or what they'd do with it, but he said the alternative was to have another forgettable interview where he promoted his movie, smiled at the right times, and everyone moved on having learned nothing and changed nothing. At least this way, there was a chance someone watching might think differently about media, about responsibility, about their own role in these systems. Michael nodded slowly. He said that was fair, that maybe discomfort was the point, that maybe making people think was more valuable than making them comfortable. But then, he asked Denzel something more personal. He asked if this approach, this willingness to confront and challenge, ever isolated him, ever made relationships difficult, ever made him wonder if it was worth it. Denzel paused, and for the first time in the interview, something in his expression softened genuinely. He said yes, absolutely, that speaking truth doesn't make you popular, that challenging systems means challenging people who benefit from those systems, that he'd lost opportunities and relationships because of his unwillingness to just go along, but the alternative felt worse, that staying silent when you see problems, that prioritizing comfort over conviction, that felt like a different kind of loss, one that ate at you from the inside. Michael asked if Denzel ever regretted it, ever wished he'd played the game differently, been more strategic, more diplomatic. Denzel said of course he had moments of doubt, moments where he questioned whether his approach was effective or just self-righteous. But then he'd see young actors navigating the same pressures he faced decades ago. He'd watch the industry repeat the same patterns, and he'd realize that nothing changes if everyone just protects themselves and their careers. The energy in the studio had shifted. This wasn't just a debate anymore, it was something more honest, more vulnerable. Michael leaned back and said he respected what Denzel was saying, that he understood the frustration. But there had to be room for people who try to make change from within, who work with systems rather than against them. Not everyone can be a revolutionary. And maybe that's okay. Denzel agreed that not everyone needs to be a revolutionary, but everyone needs to be honest about what they're doing and why. If you're making compromises for practical reasons, own that. Don't pretend it's the only option. If you're prioritizing your career security, acknowledge that. Don't dress it up as serving the greater good. The problem isn't that people make different choices. It's that we're not honest about what those choices mean and what they cost. Michael asked what honesty looks like in practice, what he should actually do differently starting tomorrow. Denzel said he should ask himself before every show, before every interview, whether he's serving the public or serving the system. He should identify moments where those interests conflict and be willing to advocate for the public even when it's inconvenient. He should use his platform to amplify voices and stories that wouldn't otherwise get heard. Michael said that sounded good in theory, but what about when his producers say no, when his bosses push back, when the network has different priorities? Denzel said, then you have a choice. You either make noise about it, you go on record with your objections, you make it costly for them to ignore you, or you accept it and acknowledge that you chose your job over your principles in that moment. Both are valid choices, but you can't pretend you didn't have a choice. Michael brought up something that had been implicit throughout. He said this interview would definitely make headlines, would get shared and discussed, would probably generate exactly the kind of viral attention Denzel had criticized earlier. He asked if there was irony in that, if they were feeding the very machine they were critiquing. Denzel smiled slightly, the first real smile of the interview. He said absolutely, there was irony, that they were having a conversation about media spectacle that would become a media spectacle, but the content of the spectacle mattered, that going viral for confronting real issues was different from going viral for manufactured drama or celebrity gossip. Michael challenged that, asking if Denzel with certain people would engage with the substance or if they'd just take sides, decide who won the argument, reduce the whole thing to a narrative about conflict. Denzel said he wasn't certain at all, that media literacy is a real problem, but that's why these conversations need to happen, why people with platforms need to model what substantive discussion looks like, even knowing it might get reduced to something simpler. Michael was quiet for a moment, then he said something unexpected. He thanked Denzel, sincerely, for pushing him, for not letting him off easy, for treating the conversation as important enough to fight about. He said he might not agree with everything Denzel said, might not be ready to blow up his career tomorrow, but he'd heard things he needed to hear. Denzel acknowledged that, said he appreciated Michael's willingness to engage rather than just shut down. He said that's what real dialogue requires, people willing to be uncomfortable, willing to have their assumptions questioned. But then Michael pressed one more time. He asked Denzel directly, what did he want from this interview? What was the goal? Denzel said he wanted people watching to think about their own complicity in the systems they complain about, to recognize that change requires participation. He wanted people in media to examine their choices more honestly, to stop hiding behind audience demand or corporate pressure, to take responsibility for their influence. Michael said those were big goals for one morning show interview. Denzel agreed, said maybe it was naive, maybe this would just be another viral moment that gets forgotten by tomorrow. But you have to try. You have to believe that words and ideas matter, that conversations can shift perspectives, even if you can't measure the impact. The segment was running absurdly long now. Michael glanced off camera and acknowledged it out loud. He said they needed to wrap, that the show had to continue. But before they ended, he wanted to say one more thing. He said Denzel had accused him, not directly but implicitly, of playing it safe, of choosing comfort over courage. And Denzel was probably right about some of that. But he also said he wasn't ready to give up on the idea that you can work within institutions and still make them better. That incremental change might be slower, but it's also more sustainable than constant confrontation. Denzel didn't argue with that. He said there's room for different approaches, that institutional change and external pressure both matter, but everyone needs to be honest about what they're doing, about their motivations, about the trade-offs they're making. Michael extended his hand, and Denzel shook it. The gesture felt significant, like an acknowledgement that despite the tension, despite the disagreement, there was mutual respect. The studio audience, which had been remarkably quiet throughout, erupted in applause. As the show cut to commercial, Michael looked drained but energized. Denzel remained composed, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew this interview would have consequences, that it might matter or it might not, but at least he'd said what he believed needed saying. The interview became instant news. Clips circulated online within minutes. Some praised Denzel for holding media accountable, for refusing to play along with superficial celebrity culture. Others criticized him for being self-righteous, for attacking Michael personally. Some defended Michael for engaging with the critique rather than shutting it down. Others felt he'd been put in an impossible position. What was undeniable was that the interview had struck a nerve. It had articulated tensions that many people felt but rarely heard, discussed so directly. Whether it would lead to any meaningful change remained to be seen. But for a moment, at least, it had made people pay attention, made them think, made them question assumptions they might not have examined otherwise. The interview ended without resolution, without easy answers, without anyone definitively winning. Both men had made strong points, both had revealed vulnerabilities, both had demonstrated conviction. And maybe that was the point, that real dialogue doesn't produce neat conclusions, that wrestling with difficult questions matters even when you can't solve them. Denzel's film still came out, still got promoted, still found its audience. Michael continued hosting Good Morning America, continued navigating the tensions between substance and entertainment. The industry kept functioning largely as it had before, with all its contradictions intact. But something had shifted, subtly, maybe temporarily, but genuinely. People were talking about things they hadn't been talking about, questioning things they hadn't been questioning. And while one interview couldn't transform an entire industry, it had created a moment of possibility. A reminder that different conversations were possible if people were brave enough to have them. So, what do you think? Was Denzel right to push Michael the way he did? Or did he cross a line? Was Michael's defense of working within the system reasonable, or just an excuse for not taking bigger risks? Drop a comment below and make sure you subscribe, because conversations like this, debates about media, about responsibility, about how we engage with the world, these are the discussions we need to keep having, even when they're uncomfortable, especially when they're uncomfortable.